I would like to thank Promote Ukraine organization and its leader Marta Baradi for organizing such a wonderful event, the Roundtable on Human Rights in Crimea. I think this event is very important today at the background of Russian deceitful propaganda, because exchanging of views and sharing the truth with members of international community works for the victory of Ukraine. So the mission of Ukraine to NATO supports and will continue supporting Promote Ukraine team in all their activities, since they are very important and useful. The truth is on our side, and we think such outreach activities as today's roundtable will contribute to fighting Russian aggressive anti-Ukrainian propaganda.
Of the story. So I would like to see as many Russians over there and hear the same story. And then they will say, oh, there are also human rights violations in Ukraine done by the Ukrainian government. And we also lost a lot of territory after the Cold War, much more than Ukraine. And the start of the crisis is not February 2014, but it started in 1994.
It started in 1650.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't interrupt you. If I now put my third glasses on, as an advisor of the Belgian government, for instance, I see that there are not only refugees in Ukraine, but there are 50 million refugees worldwide. There are dozens of conflicts in the world. And Belgium is a small country. We only have limited resources. So we should make priorities. So why would we care about your conflict and not about the Middle East? That's very hard. So let me say then that I agree that even from that point of view, what Putin did is completely wrong. It was not done in the last 5 decades. It's against all the rules of international law, the UN Charter, so it should be condemned, and we should sanction him, the country. Between Russia and Europe is more important than between Ukraine and Georgia and Europe. If you don't get the relationship straight with Russia, you will get even more problems in the future. If we improve the situation only in Ukraine, we will get a lot of trouble in the future by Russia. And there's one rule in international politics, that's what the realists say: the relationship with the big powers is more important than with smaller powers. I don't like to say this. I'm not happy when I say this, but we should also look how this crisis has erupted. And it's not only an aggression by one side, it's also that the West did not respect Russia after the end of the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact imploded, our alliance still exists. Why do we still need an alliance? Against what threat? It's per definition against an external threat, looking for new threats. Now, in the 90s, Russia was a partner, so why did we need NATO? It was a strategic partner. There were Russians in Evre at the headquarters, and there are still Russians. So we better would have integrated Russia and Ukraine in a kind of European security architecture. Not in the form of collective defense, but in the form of collective security. Kind of mini United Nations, if you that would have been much more stable in the long term. What we now did is expanding NATO against the will of Russia. Even announcing in 2008 that we would take in Ukraine and Georgia. It was against the European wishes. It was President Bush himself who pushed that through at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008, against the European wishes. But we had to follow. We predicted this conflict. So I'm afraid, I think that the only solution in the end is to integrate Russia first, and then Ukraine and Georgia. I'm provoking a little bit. And that would be the best also for Ukraine and Georgia. Economically speaking, I think, I'm not an economist, but I think Ukraine should be able to collaborate with the West and the East, with Europe and with Russia. We're living in a globalized world, so that should in principle be doable. But from a security perspective, I think Ukraine may forget NATO membership, like Georgia. We will never admit them. That would be my advice, except if we also integrate Russia in this European security architecture. That's it.
So let's can add to this discussion is a kind of a longer term perspective. And let me be very clear that one, I am very much convinced that under current international law, the annexation of Crimea is against all rules and regulations. And secondly, my heart goes out no less than my colleagues here to the plight of the people that have to suffer this. While it would probably be big fun for me to go back to 1654, I'll recognize that my time is limited, and so I think that from a historical point of view, we have to consider this very much from the moment of the breakup of the Soviet Union, that it set in motion a process of which we are reaping the bitter fruits today. We have to realize that the Russian Federation, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, was politically a humbled power. From one of the chief powers in the world, it fell to a much smaller territory, went through a very difficult transformation process, political and economical, was a very weak country economically for many years. And this humbling experience, I think, is part of the mix of what we are seeing today. Of course, I also realize that other countries, other former Soviet republics went through a very difficult phase. I'm not trying to imply, not at all, that the Russians were the only ones who suffered in this process, far from it. But I'm not a Russian, and I'm not a Russophile either, but I'm trying to understand as an historian what goes on here. Now, the last decade or so, we have seen a reassertion of Russian might in the region, and not just versus Ukraine, but certainly also versus other bordering states. The Baltic states feel an increasing pressure on the military front. The case of Georgia is certainly very well known to you all. And there is a certain pattern there, a pattern that uses a certain weakness, that, or at least a phenomenon that was a weakness in the beginning, namely the fact that the breakup of the Soviet Union left large groups of Russian minorities in former Soviet republics. This weakness is now being turned into an instrument against these countries. That happened almost right from the start in Moldova, where the Transnistrian Republic was declared very shortly after Moldovan independence. You certainly know about the problems in Georgia with some of the subject republics there. And in the Ukrainian polity, as far as I understand this, the volatility of the electoral process right from the beginning of independence has also been largely colored by the presence of a Russian minority in certain parts of the country. It's for those countries, for a country in general terms, seeking to reassert its power, and I think that's certainly what's going on with the Russian Federation right now. The presence of their own minorities across the borders is always a very welcome excuse and a very interesting thing to grasp onto in order to mingle in other people's territory. Secondly, I think, and my colleague already alluded to it, this is also part of the big game. I mean, this is not the big game of the 19th century colonialism, but this is the big game between the United States and the Russian Federation. And in that big game, I do think that the West has been at least a bit careless or uncautious in the way it has tried to approach this thing. And that unfortunately, and to my great regret, at this moment the Crimean population is paying part of the price for that. I am not an expert on security constructions like my colleague, but I do think that for a country like the Russian Federation, I can't look into these people's heads, but I do have a certain idea of what they might be thinking, at least I hope so, is that the idea that NATO would actually incorporate places like Ukraine is utterly unacceptable. Particularly if some of your prime military bases, and I'm talking like a Machiavellian, I realize that, but I think I ought to do this here. If one of your prime military bases in Sebastopol would then end up firmly within NATO territory. A third element in this reassertion, and that's probably the one that most of all brings us together here today, is that what you do notice in this process is that there is a certain discourse developed from the Russian side which tends to draw a distinction, or which at least tends to suggest that there are different versions of human rights, and that there are different versions of democracy going around this world, and that democracy means something else in Russia than what it means in a place like Belgium. And that it is, of course, very much a way of telling Western powers or Western states to shut up and not get involved with what goes on within the Russian Federation or within the Crimea. But it is, I think, interesting in the way that it harkens back very much to a form of political reasoning that was also very much present in the Soviet Union. Now, a last point I would like to raise. I had made all sorts of notes about the ethnic diversity of Ukraine and the Crimea, but I'm sure that in this audience this is certainly not necessary to repeat. But as somebody who tends to look more on long term, because I am an early modernist, my prevailing feeling about all this is that, and this is perhaps the most unsettling of them all, that this in many ways is a sign that the Putin regime is weakening. That there is this enormous show of force. There is this attempt to reach or to capture a few soft targets in neighboring lands. But in many ways, I think this shows that this regime is a regime that's on the verge of crisis, and that by making a big international stance is trying to shut down opposition in its own country. In that sense, and that may be a bit tortuous as a reasoning, but in many ways the solution for the Ukrainian crisis probably lies within the Russian Federation, if it lies anywhere. Thank you.
What were the key players in the former Soviet Union? And Ukraine is actually the key to understanding Russia. Once Ukraine is a truly democratic, prosperous country, there is a hope for Russian Federation, for Russians on the ground. I agree with Professor Timothy Snyder, who I admire a big deal, who is a historian from Yale and who's been educated in Europe. I do believe this Ukraine is a post-colonial, what we are dealing right now is Ukraine is post-colonial state, and Russian Federation is dealing with imperialistic processes that Europe has dealt a long time ago. And those issues need to be obviously addressed and understand, taken into consideration when we look into this picture. With respect to Crimea being forgotten, we would never say this, make this argument in Quebec or Scotland. We know there is a democratic process how to deal with those issues. The same process was written down in the Ukrainian constitution how to deal with questions of territorial integrity. We shouldn't, in the global world, impose double standards. It sends a very wrong message to our friends and allies in Middle East as well, and who may think that we are playing with values and standards, which is not a good practice with respect to security. And with respect to Russian minority, just briefly, during Maidan and in the last pretty much 25 years, Ukraine has shown that there are no issues with respect to Russian language, Ukrainian language. Ukrainian Russians, well-integrated Ukrainian Russians, Ukrainian Jews are Ukrainian Jews, Ukrainian Crimean Tatars are Crimean Tatars. They all supported the same values at Maidan. I don't believe we should look at those minority issues, because then we are actually facing the same trouble and opening the door for Mexico to go and claim the territory of Texas or California perhaps. Switzerland may be at stake, territorial integrity, and many territories in Europe as well. When we do a good analysis of transfer of Crimea in 1954 and international laws, and I welcome you to read and give us the feedback, of course.
Okay.
I hear your comments about security issues, about Russia integration, about partnership. But I have some concerns, and I really don't understand why a relationship with Russia is more important than a relationship with Ukraine and Georgia. And I don't like to ask you for a lecture, and I don't want to ask you for a lecture, but if you could point out at least 2 or 3 reasons why, we would all really appreciate that. And don't you think that making things right in Ukraine will show the Russia that acting in this way isn't acceptable? It will show the Russia the president, and will demonstrate how democratic we are, and that we care about our partners. Another thing, I'm really concerned about integrating the state and whose representatives are lying to us and whom we cannot trust at all, who are using troops without insignia, who is painting car plates in different colors, who is dressing their army troops in the uniform of other states. I wouldn't like to integrate with this kind of people, and if you can explain why you would like, it would be nice. And another issue with human rights. I'm sure that Russian Federation and its representatives would claim and do claim that there are many human rights violations on the side of Ukrainian government, but today we are discussing Crimea, and with respect to Crimea, current Ukrainian government had no time to act in violation of human rights, because Crimea was taken about Russian Federation only a couple of days after revolution and after ousting the former president Yanukovych. And all world observed that killings, disappearances, detentions, searches, seizures started to happen only after annexation, illegal annexation, after referendum. Here we have only proofs to different sides. And I only can say that the crisis in Ukraine could be predicted, and some people might have predicted the crisis of Ukraine. And if you had predicted the crisis in Ukraine, when you haven't acted to prevent it, is my concern. And another thing, it was visible that something is going on, because when we started to address the issue of special forces in Ukraine, we discovered that majority of them were located in Crimea. So the question is why, and why national and international security forces were not asking why there is a huge location of special forces in one place and Sinai Peninsula. So those are my comments and concerns, and there are many questions.
Maybe one additional comment.
World War, after the Great War, World War I, Hitler Germany also felt offended and humiliated, and made bid for reassertion of its power and restoration of its influence. And then Western power, Western democracy decided to sacrifice Czechoslovakia in order to appease Hitler. And we know what came out of such diplomacy and such policy. The Second World War started with huge suffering for whole Europe. And now we are witnessing the same situation. You have to understand it. Thank you.
If I may, I have just one example which explains, which is slightly for a different area, but I think logic would be very much the same, with which the people would be controlled of. Recently in Russia there was a huge scandal in Republic of Chechnya. Probably heard of it. I believe you did actually. It's quite a specific territory with a lot of people with whose religion is they're Muslims, majority of them. So recently, one of henchmen of Kadyrov, man who's officially was told he was 48 years old, but realistically, really, he's 58 years old. He married 16 years old teenager. And what Kadyrov said to that, although this was against Russian law, he said, well, they fell in love, so there's nothing wrong about it. So if she loves him, never mind that she's 16 years old. And moreover, then Mr. Sergei Astahov, who's an ombudsman, who follows, who should actually watch very closely on human rights violations, he said, you know, yeah, this is against Russian law, but you see, this is specific territory, and this is very typical for this region, and this is very typical for Muslim traditions. So, of course, this is a clear violation of law, but I see nothing wrong about all this situation. And this is exactly the same logic which you described, and I think that this exactly example which says how Russia became rotten, how Russia became absolutely ill-minded, and which arguments they are using, and moreover, and this is absolutely cynically for Russian people, the situation was absolutely okay.
And if I may add about that situation, not only he married that woman, he was also married. So they actually would like to change the laws for and bigamy and make bigamy legal. And not only this, there are many cases. There are more cases of women's circumcision that are apparently happening in Russian Federation. So what we see in Russian Federation is completely different that we would like to see, and what we examine. Through academically speaking, and when I was a student and I studied international relations as well, and I was always puzzled why West doesn't get this. Why West, when they look into KGB, don't realize that the KGB was only built on the fact, wasn't built on intelligence. The intelligence units were only created in the 80s, and the only power of former Soviet Russian Federation is that they don't value human life, that they can throw as many humans because they don't value. And if you look at how they treat in human beings in the eastern Ukraine, how they bury them or not bury them, how they basically don't even allow their parents and someone who will tell that their child died in that in the war, he can go to prison up to 7 years. This is what has been going on, and that has been unfortunately neglected. We've been focused too much on NATO. I do not agree that NATO knocked on Russian Federations. No, all the meetings and all the Russian Federation was always welcomed, was always present there. This is a cynical game I do believe that the Russian Federation is playing with respect to NATO knocking on its door. Look how many, it was more than 130 something violations of European Union's territorial integrity, while their airplanes and their submarines were detected on the border. And why it's important, because this is basically on your border. This is the people at Maidan, they showed they know what's right, what's wrong, that they know the real values. They wanted to live in the country with the rule of law, in truly democratic country. That's all they wanted. And when it was taken from them, when their children were beaten up, Maidan was dying. But once former president, former regime ordered to beaten up those children, the adults came out because they knew that they had nothing to lose. They already suffered, at least for their children, their grandchildren, to live in a better society. And Maidan was standing there for 3 months until other orders were made.
Okay, thank you.
So the question, why is Russia more important? Not for me personally, but again, if you look it through the glasses of international relations, a realist theory, it's very simple. You know, Russia has much more military power and economic power. Military, I mean, the whole gamut. You know, they are now running their bombers over our territories, submarines in the North Sea.
They were tanks on your territory.
Then economic power, they have the gas. Ukraine felt already the power of Russia. If they just turn the gas, they shut it down, then you feel it immediately. So they have power, you know. According to the realists, international politics is just about power, you know? And you have less power. That's just a given. You can't argue against that. Now, if we treat Ukraine in the short term better and integrate Ukraine and Georgia, we make the Russians even more angry, as they're already now. So they will react. They can react. They have the possibility to react. I'm not saying that they will do, but the chances are that they will do. And there might be a big conflict, not only locally, but in the region and in the world. You know? So don't be surprised that we don't like to provoke Russia further. So I repeat myself, we should first improve the relationship with Russia, and if that happens, the odds are that the relationship with Ukraine and Georgia.
Would you like to, would either of you like to say something about the comparison with the Czech Republic? I mean,
I made that comparison by myself, but maybe.
Oh, I think it's very relevant in many ways. I mean,
One more.
but I don't think I've said anything in the nature of trying to condone what's going on. The point I was trying to make, but perhaps I didn't make it very clearly, is that I think that, and this is very unfortunate, the resolution for the Ukraine crisis is not in Ukraine. It is to be found in Russia. I don't think only a change of regime can lead to a non-violent solution for this problem.
That's true.
And it is not Ukrainian crisis. This crisis was created by Russian aggression. There is no crisis in Ukraine. There is aggression of Russia against Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And I believe that all we need good relationship with Russia. And do you know what can create proper and very solid premises for good relationship with Russia? And Ukraine membership to NATO. When Ukraine became a member of NATO, Russia will understand that it is impossible to realize its imperialistic plans for creating a Russian world. And remember, tense relationship between Russia and Poland when Poland decided to become member of NATO. Poland was invited to NATO, relations were normalized, the same as Baltic states. So it is unrealistic to think that barring Ukraine from NATO will appease Russia and make Russia very polite, happy with Ukraine. You're deeply mistaken.
Okay, one more, otherwise we're going to go into a...
I think it's very important to look to history and see how we treat the losers of wars. Nowadays, Napoleon is in the picture. He lost here in Waterloo, but we integrated France into European security architecture, and there was stability for decades. After the First World War, as you said, we made a mistake, I think. Germany felt it as a diktat, you know, and we created more or less the Second World War. It stimulated, at least, it was one important element at least. But after the Second World War, we learned our lesson, and we integrated the losers, Japan and Germany, in the world economic and political system. We did it right. After 1990, we did it wrong. Because what did we promise? And I quote, you know, Genscher, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, in the framework of the negotiations about German reunification. He said in February 1990, it is for NATO to declare unequivocally, irrespective of whatever happens with the Warsaw Pact, because the Warsaw Pact existed still at that time, and the USSR as well, there will be no expansion of NATO's territory to the east, that is, closer to the borders of the Soviet Union. And I have 4 or 5 of these quotations by Genscher and by James Baker, February 1990. Promise to Gorbachev.
The Soviet Union.
Promise to Gorbachev.
The Soviet Union.
To the Soviet Union, yeah?
But Soviet Union
The
doesn't
Soviet
work.
Union and Russia, it's not the same thing.
Hello.
I'm sorry. Different
So if
countries.
we then expand NATO against the wishes of the Russians, I think we did not respect them, and they became angry.
Do you respect us,
Of
Ukraine
course.
as sovereign state?
Of
I'm
course,
sorry.
of course.
I'm sorry. Do you respect Ukraine as sovereign state?
You know
With
that-
their right to be the part of democratic and independent world?
You know, you're quite right, mentioning Germany and Japan as powers which became part of the Western world. But Germany and Japan wanted to be reintegrated and cooperate with Western world. Russia is not willing to integrate with Western world. Russia is willing to dictate West their rules of behavior. And Russia wants to ruin the order which was created by civilized nations. This is a big difference. You have to understand it.
Okay, thank you. I would like to open the floor to some questions or other comments if some are forthcoming. Yes, and keep it short because we have 20 minutes left, so we also want responses, right? Okay.
I had a question for Mr. Vasilenko. You mentioned that Russia was trying to create a Russian world or a Russian world order. What do you mean by that exactly? Could you give some specifications about that?
Okay. But we'll do a few questions more? Yes?
Okay.
I have the impression that, of course, as academics, we try to keep a stance from a situation that is happening without being involved personally. And that is what Professor Sauer also tried to, it was also my personal stance. I think everyone, as an ordinary citizen in Europe, they don't want to be occupied. We as Belgium, we have experience with occupation. We know what it is. Yeah. Okay? But you have to understand, if you appealing to a larger constituency, to people, because you said, okay, we're now in the occupied zone and the human rights there are not going well. Even it's going backwards in general progress, let's say. We understand, but the only point we were trying to make here, we as a European entity, we have been blamed for imperialism, which is okay. We have been blamed for all kinds of things, all the things that happened to the Second World War. Everyone here now that's some sort of a guilt clause. But nowadays we're in 2015, and we have to think politically and we have to think globally. And it's just a suggestion. If, as the professor just said, if indeed the reign of Putin inside is going not well because maybe there are dissidents of people other for power, then there might be an opportunity. But rushing in, ill-advised, is a very, very dangerous thing. And we cannot afford it, because if you turn it, they're both still nuclear powers. And nuclear powers, they have more rights than other states in the world. And that's the final problem. And it's not that the Western people, and maybe I'm just talking for the rest of the population here, we don't condone what's happening there. We all do. We're just trying how to do it as simple as possible without making, let's say, very unrepairable breaks. And we don't know how. You guys are the experts, but I cannot refrain from the idea that you are so invested emotionally, which is normal, and it contrasts a little bit with the view of, let's say, the academics. It's a general remark. So I find it very strange, because in the end we all have to solve it, because, as you said, Russia maybe wants its own world corner.
Okay, thank you.
I already answered your question. Ukraine has to be invited to be member of NATO. That's first of all. The second, Russia is obsessed, Russian leadership is obsessed with the restoration of Russian Empire in the border of 1914 and even beyond this border. Read Russian statements of Russian politicians, Russian leaders, and you'll see their demand and their willingness for restoration of empire. And they call this empire Russian world. The world where Russian language, Russian culture, Russian values, Russian traditions are dominated, and the rest has to be eliminated, completely eliminated. It is their philosophy, and they are trying to impose this philosophy on the rest of the world, not only on Ukraine. You have to understand it. And to resist this temptation, to resist this dictatorship, imperialistic dictatorship, we have to unite our forces and to unite our efforts to cope with such aggression, with such aggressive attitude. You know, it is not the competition between two civilizations. It is competition, it is a struggle between civilization and barbarianism, which is cultivated, openly cultivated by Russian leadership and Russian propaganda now. Just look at the Russian mass media, look at their historical works, look at the literature, Russian literature, modern Russian literature, and you'll see it. It is evidently.
Okay, you wanted to?
Yeah, one name I haven't heard so far here is China. We entered into a multipolar world, and a new balance, or maybe it's not a balance, geopolitically. And my question is maybe like to you and to Professor Sauer. What's the role of China in this conflict, or where do they have interests, or where can Russia behave well badly, or what's their border to stretch in relation to China?
It was an interesting remark by my colleague that he believes that the regime is weakening. I hope so, and by the sanctions we implement, we hope to weaken the Putin regime, and that the people inside Russia change from bottom up the regime, because we cannot do that. It should come up from the bottom up. But for the moment, I don't have the impression that it is working. I mean, Putin is still very popular, apparently. And it's very important because, and I didn't mention that, but the crisis started mainly domestically. Putin had a problem in 2011, 2012. There were social protests, political protests on the streets, a lot of people in Moscow against the Putin regime. And he then misused this external problem and NATO expansion and for his own survival. I agree. But we give him, we helped him a lot by doing so, by provoking him. So there is a there are these two dimensions.
One final remark.
Yeah, but okay, you say you don't like Putin as we do, so you agree with us, but we disagree with you that you don't realize what politics of the Putin regime are trying to do. And in fact, it's a contemporary Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, which is to disintegrate Europe by working on its far-right parties, by helping the far-right and far-left parties, and trying to disintegrate the European Union, so it can become weaker, and he can impose its power, its ultimate power, on the European Union and the West, and install the Ruski Mir everywhere. Thank you.
Okay. No. Thank you very much for.
I have a question for the human rights activists. I'm curious why you suggested a special tribunal for Ukraine instead of the International Criminal Court. I'm wondering if you think the International Criminal Court also has a role in prosecuting human rights abuses, and also I'm curious if the European you mentioned you just came from Strasbourg. The European Court of Human Rights has heard human rights cases, and if so, how have those gone so far?
Okay, so that's a very specific question. We'll deal with the role of China first, maybe, and then take on the then take on the human rights, or the other way around. Doesn't matter. If you want to, okay, you go ahead.
I think as I've read, I'm not so closely to that. I understand what you said. I'm not that close to the case. I'm Brazilian. I live in Singapore. I practice there, and so it also helps what happened in Asia. Also because there the name China comes more to our minds more than Russia. And what I see there, Singapore is I work as a tax attorney, and I see a lot of things happening with transaction money flow, and that comes into the what Professor Durlu, sorry. Talk. I see a lot of money flowing out of Russia. Russian investors concerned on what's happening, so they're using structures to take that money out of Russia. And that's what it's important for the West to take a position, because the sanctions might not looking, but they are having impact. And so I think it's for the West as a whole to decide if they're going, which way they're going to, they're going to impose these sanctions, they're going to strengthen. Because as a nuclear power, it's harder to make comply. They have veto on the United Nations. That's why you have alternative ways to, if you want to make them comply with international law, you have to find different ways to address that. You cannot just send some troops to Russia. It's not possible to do that. So that's why we're discussing here. One way is to increase cost of investment in Russia, increase cost. Make business with that. You can really make taxes higher. You can tax companies that income that comes from Russia. That's in fact it doesn't look, but it's an effective tool. Swiss now it's they never say Swiss is never going to give information about tax to other countries, and they are giving out because they enforce regulation. Countries like the United States impose a tax on Switzerland if they are not comply. So you have to figure out alternative ways to deal with Russia. And from what I sense living in Singapore, where China is more present, the South China Sea has been becoming a point of disturbance, and it's quite clear for us there that China is waiting the outcome of what's happening in Ukraine and in the region, how the West is going to deal with the situation. Because China has already started to test, like in the same pattern that Russia did first with Transnistria, then Georgia, then Ukraine, always increasing the power of the actions. China started to do the same in Asia, like constructing forts in the islands, testing Japan, testing Korea by using North Korea. So it's really important how the West is dealing with Russia, because that is a powerful message to China as well. That's what I sense.
And just to add to this one sentence, that, you know, again, I agree, the emotional component has to be out of this debate. But it does remind me when I was a student in school, and I struggled as a student was the same, it was very hard to explain that the West again misunderstood so many things about how the Soviet Union existed and what exactly was the premises of Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union still pretty much exists in Russian Federation in their minds. And just to give you an example, in 2007 I met a lovely young lady who took the same course with me from Russian Federation, and I asked her, so how many students do you have from Russia this year? And she told me, she started counting, and then there were kind of 2 students from Ukraine. And she counted me, and I was like, well, I'm not from Russian Federation. And she was like, wow, you must be the Westerner. And it was surprising for me because she didn't know anything about me. And then she counted another student from Odessa. She was like, well, Odessa is Russia. So it was 2007, and this is not a small anecdote. This is a real thing that it just struck me as a puzzling thing that was in their minds. With respect to, and I would like to go to the recommendations, we welcome you to look into all of them. We do see the role for ICC, for ICJ, for the advisory opinion. We do recommend using all those tools. And of course, the society has a huge wounds, and there are many human rights violations only on the top level.
What we've done, we're now producing a TV program for the oldest commercial TV company, Chernomorska TV station, which has been shut down in Crimea, and they moved to mainland in Ukraine. So now they broadcast in internet and satellite. We have our weekly program, Free Crimea, focused on human rights, focused on economic situation, Russian military presence in there, because probably you heard of that, Russia, what they're doing these days, they're trying to relaunch nuclear program. In Soviet times, I remember this, there were 2 biggest nuclear facilities in Crimea, one of which is very close to the city of Feodosia in eastern Ukraine, other is located very close to city of Yalta. It's one of the biggest tourist attractions in Crimea, and Russians have already made public their plans to launch at least one nuclear facility near the city of Feodosia by 2020. So we're producing monthly reports, and which we circulate between embassies. And we work very closely, mostly with Canadians and the United States government. I was in Congress and Department of State a month ago, where we presented our Black Book of Occupation of Crimea. But to put it bluntly, we see very small interest in situation in Crimea, especially in terms of human rights, from European institutions. It's more relevant than we work on basis with some countries, like Scandinavian countries, Baltic states, for instance, who understand absolutely perfectly what Russia is now doing these days. But we see a lot of reluctance in this situation, especially from Germany, from France, and to put it bluntly, no response from your government as well. Meanwhile, as like I said, situation with our people, with our rights, especially religious rights as well, they should be mentioned, of course, because, for instance, in Crimea, there are 400,000 Protestants, people mostly witnesses of Jehovah's Adventists, whose rights has been violated by Russian occupants. For instance, at the time, then it was Ukrainian-controlled territory, there were nearly 3,000 religious communities, Protestant, mostly Protestant and Muslim communities. By this date, Russians have registered only 14 out of 3,000 religious communities, just altogether combined, I mean, Muslim and Protestant communities. And because in Russia, officially, there is only one church, it's Russian Orthodox Church. All others, including Muslims, Crimean Tatars, including Protestants, or Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they are not prohibited literally, but they experience a lot of problems with registration, with pressure from local governments, and so on. Case in a very small town, Lenina, in eastern Crimea, the local businessman has been arrested after talking in a queue. He was just in a queue in a local supermarket, and he complained about that after Russian occupation he experienced a lot of problems with tax service, and he said that his business was nearly down. And he was arrested, interrogated by police for 3 hours, just on the basis that someone from the queue said that that guy was saying some bad information about President Putin and about Russia's regime. So that's basically what we do now.
Due to the stubborn refusal of Russia to stop a war of aggression against Ukraine and to comply with generally recognized principles of international law as well as internationally recognized standards of human rights,